Okay, so I'd like to take this opportunity to share my story with you. Very soon after my marriage broke down, I met a man who would change my life forever. We had a mutual friend on Facebook, and this is how we started chatting. He contacted me to say he thinks he knows me and we used to work together. I assured him he didn't, but the conversation just kind of went from there. I was instantly attracted to his pictures on Facebook, and he was so funny and charming. I hadn't felt so happy in as long as I could remember. We first met up about a week after we started chatting. We arranged to meet in the local pub for a drink, and I was just so nervous and so excited. We hit it off instantly. It felt like I'd known him forever and I could tell him anything. I'd never felt so wanted, so loved in the eyes of another. I would smile to myself all the time and think, wow, after all these years, I now understand what real love feels like. We'd only been dating for a few weeks, but knew I'd met my soulmate, the man I would spend the rest of my life with. I was still a mum above anything else, so we continued to spend a lot of time texting and chatting. He'd usually be out at the pub, but it didn't really bother me because I just thought, well, he's got no reason not to. And even though he was out, he'd be in constant contact with me, making me laugh, telling me how he couldn't wait to see me. He couldn't wait until I told my kids about him so he could spend more time with me and not have to go out all the time to kind of fill up the empty spaces. The weekend came and we went to the casino. Everything was perfect. We were drinking, we were dancing, we played some card games. Then we sat down and began chatting. I don't remember the details of what we were talking about, but I'll never forget that he pushed me so hard that I fell to the floor and bruised all down the side of my leg. I felt a little winded, but he was laughing, and he said he didn't mean for it to be so hard. He was just joking round. I was kind of shocked, but I left it there. After all, we'd both had too much to drink, so that must be why it happened. I'd been dating him for around 2 months when I told my girls about him. They were very excited to meet him. That evening he came round and we ordered a takeaway. He made them giggle with funny jokes and stories, and I was so happy with how my girls felt about him. Also how amazing he was with them. He started spending a lot of time at our home, just chatting, watching the TV, and really getting to know each other. He would tell me how happy he was and how he always wanted to be part of a loving family, as his upbringing had lots of memories of abuse from his father to his mother, and he was so happy to have finally found a real, loving, caring home with me. He would send me beautiful quotes all the time, and when we were apart, he'd always be checking up on me to see if I was okay and what I was up to. I thought this was lovely. He was so kind and so thoughtful. He asked what I thought about a weekend away, and I jumped at the chance. I couldn't wait. He told me that we were going to go to Amsterdam, and I was made up. I told my mum and my friends. But when we got to the check-in, I discovered that we were going to Dublin. I asked why he'd lied to me, but you could see he was getting wound up. He was just playing a joke and he didn't really see the problem. I didn't really want to ruin the trip, so I just said, okay, sorry for questioning him, and I didn't mean to be ungrateful. We were in Dublin for 3 nights, and the only thing we did was go to the pubs from early afternoon until early hours of the morning. On the second night, around midnight, I asked if it'd be okay to go soon. I was really tired. He said yeah, but he proceeded to buy another drink. I accepted that, but again he went and he bought another drink. I was fed up now, so I went on my Facebook. He was furious and he wouldn't talk to me. I put my phone away and I said I was sorry, but it was no use, he was fuming. We went outside and he pushed me into the wall and he told me to F off back to the hotel. He was disgusted with me for ignoring him. I begged him to stop. I didn't even know the name of the hotel. Eventually we got a taxi and we went back. We didn't talk again that night. The following morning, he was still ignoring me. And after me practically pleading with him, he eventually went back to the lovely, charming man who I knew and I loved. There were no more arguments on that break, as I knew now to be careful of upsetting him. Weeks turned into months and I was getting used to him turning up at mine late and drunk. I was okay with it though, as he'd still always be messaging me while he was out. Weekends would be together all the time, usually going out drinking. After a few months had passed, he said that we were going to meet up with his mum for a drink. We had a great time, everybody knew him and would stop for a chat. When I was alone with his mum, she turned and she grabbed my arm. You do know he has problems and he's an alcoholic, don't you? How I wish I'd taken his mum's warning more seriously, but I never. I guess I just didn't want to face the truth. I believed I was different. I believed everything he told me. I believed he was my soulmate and had already started to change and work through his issues with my support. I then found out I was pregnant. When I told him the news, he held me and he cried with happiness. He said he couldn't believe how lucky he was that I was going to have his baby. Although it was very early in the relationship, I was thrilled with his response. From this point, things started to change. He'd still turn up at my home, late and drunk, but he didn't message me like he used to. Sometimes he'd turn up early hours of the morning and we'd argue. Usually the conversation was turned into what a crap mum I was and I couldn't control my kids. So instead of talking about his drinking, I'd end up spending hours defending myself and then usually apologising for getting mad. Even the weekends we'd normally spend together ended up with him promising me we were going out, but leaving me hanging. Sending the odd message saying he was on his way, promising he was coming now, but not actually arriving until around 2 a.m. in the morning. It made me so angry that I'd always believe him, and every time he would leave me alone and upset all night. We'd argue frequently, and he'd always change the subject into what a crank I was, what a crap mum, a slag, all the stories he'd heard about me. One night he was shouting so loud I was afraid that he'd wake up my girls. I asked him to be quiet. He opened the door and he shouted at the top of his voice, "Your mum's an effing slag." For the first time I'd had enough. He threatened to leave, so I said, "Good, I want you to get out my house." He glared at me and then he picked up a glass and he threw it at me. I moved and it shattered on the tiled floor behind. He then came at me and he grabbed me by my throat and he dragged me barefoot over the broken glass. I managed to get free from his grip and he proceeded to try and hit me in my pregnant stomach. Not once did he manage to. My arms took the bruises from protecting my unborn child from him. He grabbed me by the throat and he held me over the cooker. I was in total shock and I didn't know what to do until I heard the voice of my 13-year-old daughter screaming for him to leave me alone, but he still held me tight by the throat. My 8-year-old daughter then screamed hysterically for him to let go, and she clung to her sister, terrified. To this day, I don't know where I got the strength to push him off me. He went to grab me again and I pushed him with all my might into the wall, and then he left. Within the hour, I'd let him back into our home and he went upstairs to apologise to my daughter. He sat on her bed and told her he didn't mean it and he wouldn't do it again. It wasn't until after the relationship was completely over that she told me how frightened she was that night when he was in her room talking to her. Nothing changed. In fact, it got worse with each passing day. Sometimes he'd not speak to me for days, even weeks, and I would find myself constantly trying to fix our relationship. The cycle continued. We'd fight, break up, make up, fight, break up, make up. It was a never-ending cycle, but I was sure when the baby came, he'd change. My daughter tried to take her own life on 2 occasions. I would blame school pressures, mine and her dad's breakup, anything other than reality of seeing her mum so broken, so low and so dependent on the man who brought nothing but fear and heartbreak into our home was the reason for her wanting to leave the world. The abuse got worse, and after the next time he pushed me hard in my chest and he choked me, I told my mum. My family were there for me. They took all his belongings from my home, they dropped them off, and he was warned to stay away. That evening my parents stayed over, and I'm glad they did, as he arrived later in the evening wanting to talk to me. My dad told him to leave me alone. I didn't want anything more to do with him. He would text and try to talk to me, but I was too upset and I didn't respond. I decided to have a termination. I felt it would be the only way to be free from him and move forward. The only way I can describe how I felt was numb and lifeless. I cut off my feelings the best I could, apart from the times I would completely fall apart and cry in a heap on the floor for hours. The pain in my heart and confusion in my head are indescribable. The day the termination came, I was scanned. A nurse began explaining to me with the corner of the scan in my view that I'd have to take tablets first, then because I was quite far along, they would have to surgically remove the fetus. The trance I'd been in left me and I walked out of the hospital. I couldn't get rid of my baby. My mum feared that he'd always be in our lives, or maybe I'd reject the baby. I assured her that nothing would make me reject my child. A few days later, I contacted him to say I was keeping the baby. We got back together. My girls spent a lot more time with their dad, and sure enough, we fell straight back into the fighting, break-up, make-up cycle. He'd say he was the only one who wanted the baby. He'd make sure when she was older that she knew I was going to get rid of her. This was another horrible thing to add to the list of verbal abuse which broke me to hear. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, but held on to the belief that he would change when our baby was born. Right up to the birth of my daughter, the arguing and the fighting continued. Within the hour of arriving at the hospital, I'd given birth to a beautiful, healthy baby girl. He cried and he told me how happy he was, and he always wanted a baby girl. He was incredible for around 3 weeks. I thought, yes, I knew he'd change when the baby came. But once again, he stopped being there. He'd arrive late and usually drunk. When my baby was 5 weeks old, the three of us went to the lakes for a long weekend. We agreed to only take casual clothes and just relax. We ended up in pubs most days, with him looking smart in his shirts and me in my trainers and my jumpers. Everything was okay until the last night. He'd spent a lot more time on his phone and he wasn't quite himself. That night the baby wouldn't settle. I was awake comforting her. 7:30 came and she was crying again. I went through to make her a bottle. I heard him getting up and going into the bathroom, still ignoring our baby. I picked her up and I began to feed her. He didn't come back into the bedroom. Once I'd finished, we went into the living room and I asked him what was up. I hadn't even finished my sentence when he began screaming at me for slamming doors and ignoring the baby. He threw a toy at me and then he came behind and he put his hands around my throat while our baby was crying in my arms. He let go and he packed his stuff. He was furious and he screamed that he wanted to smash my head through every effing window. And then he left us there. Once I got myself together enough to drive home, we made our way. He'd taken himself to Blackpool and he'd partied for 2 nights, putting loads of photos on Facebook with all other girls and friended them onto his page. A few days passed and he apologised. He just needed to get away to sort his head out. Once again, I let him back into our home. Only this time my eldest was there. She looked at him and then she screamed at me before running up the stairs crying. He said to me, "I can't believe you told her what happened, and I shouldn't have because she hates him now." Something this time was different. I didn't feel happy he was there. I didn't believe he was sorry, and I didn't believe that he'd ever change. I asked him for over a week to remove these new girls off his Facebook and his ex, who he always refriended when we argued. And every time he told me to chill, and he promised me he'd do it. One day it just hit me. It was literally like a light bulb moment. I realised that he wasn't going to change. Because if he couldn't change for his own child, then he certainly wasn't going to change for anybody else. It was an empowering moment. I knew I was finally done and had accepted the truth. The truth that the amazing, caring, charming man I had fell in love with was not who he really was, and he was never coming back. The hardest part was accepting the truth that this person who I loved with the whole of my heart didn't love me and would never change. He didn't have a problem with himself. He had a problem with me. It was a hard pill to swallow when I finally opened my eyes and I realised that he literally enjoyed hurting me emotionally and physically, using all the things I'd told him in confidence when I believed he loved and cared for me, to use as emotional tools to break me a little more each day that we were together. I spoke with my doctor and explained that I didn't believe I had postnatal depression, but I'd left an abusive relationship and I was struggling to cope. I was prescribed some antidepressants that I never did take, because for me that wasn't the answer I was looking for, although I had no idea what the answer was. Within days I received a call from a health visitor, and I kind of rolled my eyes during the conversation, thinking it was going to be a routine tick box exercise to check if everything was okay. How wrong I was. A lovely lady named Joy arrived at my home to talk with me. She was so nice and kind. I felt completely at ease with her. Looking back, it was obvious that she herself had experienced abuse, as she just got it. She understood, and more importantly, she believed me, and she opened my eyes to just how severe the abuse was. Over the following weeks, Joy would arrive and she'd talk and support myself and my girls. On one occasion, Joy told me that I've got nothing to worry about at all, but she'd discussed my situation and a social worker wanted to have a chat and make sure we were all safe. The social worker arrived and had a talk with myself and my girls, looked around the home. Everything was fine and he left with all the information he required. My contact number was what logged with the police, so if I ever felt in danger, they would be at our home really fast to ensure our safety. Joy discussed moving to a new house, but I'd already started to look at private lettings and I'd assured her I would be moving as soon as I found the right property. Several days later, I received a call from a social worker saying that he'd spoken to my ex. My ex had stated that my behaviour was erratic and unstable. The fighting was both of us, and he had no alcohol issues. I'd made that up. When he was asked of his intentions in regards to our baby, he said he was going to walk away. Social worker stated he was shocked with his response and he told me he'd regret his decision in the future, and it also spoke volumes about his character. I took all the time I needed to grieve the loss of the man I fell in love with. I'd fall apart most days when I got time on my own. To watch a couple walk down the road together pushing the child in a pram, or a dad with his daughter, it literally tore my heart apart. I learned to slow down and take it one day at a time. I got in touch with friends and I started making plans to go out and have some fun. I also went on a few dates to break the invisible chains still connecting me to him and missing him. I just wanted to try anything that would help me stop feeling so lost and so broken. Slowly I began to hold myself together. I would still cry and often think of him and feel so much pain for his behaviour. For him not wanting, not fighting to be in his baby's life. When my daughter was 6 months old, I met somebody. We talked for several weeks before he asked me out for a coffee. He was really nice, but I wasn't looking for a relationship. I was still looking for something to heal my invisible scars. 6 years later, we're still together and engaged. He put up with my jealousy and my trust issues, my paranoia and numerous moody argumentative times that I would start on purpose. I would intentionally push his buttons as I had to know what the worst thing would happen to me would be. Would he scream at me? Would he throw things? Would he hit me? It probably took around a year before I would let my guard down, not feel jealous, not cause unnecessary arguments, and finally trust my partner. He is a kind, considerate, loving and loyal man who supports me, encourages me to try new things, achieve my goals, and is a fantastic role model to my girls and father to my baby. I was now in a happy, healthy relationship with an amazing man who loves me and my girls. But something was still missing. I had to help all the women who were in unhealthy relationships or struggling after having the courage to leave and say no more. I began researching and found Tomorrow's Women. A level 2 mentoring course was being advertised on the website and I thought, yeah, this is perfect. And I completed my course. I dropped my hairdressing job to 3 days a week and I volunteered at Tomorrow's Women for 2. I helped support a lot of women overcome barriers, make positive lifestyle changes, refer to other agencies within Tomorrow's Women to help with legal advice, financial issues, support to gain employment, along with many other areas. This was it. This was the final part of my healing. To support, to believe and to share advice on moving forward. I spoke with many different agencies at Tomorrow's Women and gained advice myself with certain issues. I spent a lot of time researching domestic abuse, the cycle of abuse, different forms of abuse, understanding inside the mind of a victim and a perpetrator. You name it, I researched it. This information enabled me to move on knowing that it was not in any way my fault and I was never going to fix him. Also, it wasn't my job to fix a grown man. More importantly, he didn't want fixing. I wasn't sure, but by now, my new goal was to always push myself out of my comfort zone. You'll never know if you never try. I guess it paid off, as I'm now working this amazing full-time role. When a job opportunity came up at Tomorrow's Women, somebody told me I should apply for it as they believed I'd make a great empowerment advisor. I wasn't so sure, but by now, my goal was to always push myself out of my comfort zone. You'll never know if you never try. I guess it paid off, as I'm working the amazing full-time role now. I don't look back at my past any longer with sadness and pain. I thank it. I never would have had my beautiful daughter. I never would have found confidence and empowerment. And I never would have been given the opportunity to be a positive role model and show my children that domestic abuse is never acceptable. And most importantly, I never would have found myself, who is stronger, wiser and more confident than I ever was before experiencing abuse. Violence and abuse against women can happen to any woman regardless of race, age, sexual orientation or religion. It affects women of all socioeconomic backgrounds and education levels. Frequent exposure to abuse in the home not only causes numerous social and physical problems, but also teaches children that abuse is a normal way of life, therefore increasing their risk of becoming society's next generation of victims and abusers. A question much too frequently asked is, why does she stay? Or why doesn't she just leave? You know why she stays? Sometimes because she looks in the mirror and she sees a stranger staring back at her. Eyes devoid of spirit, no remnants of a smile anywhere on her face. A blank, colourless mask covering the strong, independent person she used to be. She has no idea who she is anymore. Everything she thought she knew about herself has been stripped away. She knows only the continuous put-downs that have been drilled into her. You're no good, you're stupid, you're selfish. Who else would ever love you? Let's take a look at some quotes from the mouths of victims. Why did I stay? Because I thought I didn't deserve any better. I stayed because I thought if I could just be a better cook, if I could just keep the house clean, I'd lose a few pounds, then he wouldn't hurt me anymore. I stayed because my priest told me that God hates divorce. It didn't cross my mind that God might hate abuse too. I stayed because he said he'd change. He promised it was the last time. I believed him. He lied. I stayed because he controlled all the finances. I had to plan my escape for months before I even had a place to go and money for the bus to get there. I stayed because I thought love was enough to conquer all. I stayed because I was halfway across the country, isolated from my friends and family. There was no one to help me. I honestly don't know why I stayed. I was embarrassed and in denial. I stayed because I kept hoping it was a phase and that things would get better. I stayed because he told me I was damaged goods and no one else would ever want me, and I believed him. I stayed because I was scared to death. So instead of questioning why does she stay, a more suitable question would be, why does he or she do that? Why don't we do more as a society to put an end to violence and abuse against women? Your past is never meant as a life sentence. The obstacles along your journey, and with each emotional scar, you will in time rise and sparkle. So instead of asking yourself, who are you? Ask yourself, who do you want to be? You don't often get the chance to change yourself or your future path, so enjoy the opportunity. To spark change, we must talk openly and acknowledge how abuse affects our communities, our families, and our lives. We must be brave. Don't turn a blind eye. We must see the abuse. We must work together to eliminate violence and abuse against women. We must speak up. Thank you so much.